Originally from Fairport, New York, Emily joined the Labor-Religion Coalition in 2014 as lead organizer. Emily is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. She earned and was awarded the Master of Divinity degree by Union Theological Seminary in New York City, where she was a fellow in the Kairos Center, a national network of grassroots and religious leaders organizing to end poverty. It's a long road ahead. Prior to joining the Labor-Religion Coalition of New York State, Emily served as pastor of the Parkland United Methodist Church in Tacoma, Washington. Emily has worked with the United Methodist Kairos Response, a denominational network advocating for justice and human rights in Israel, Palestine, and with Christian peacemakers. She earned and was awarded a Bachelor of Arts degree in journalism at nearby Main College in Ithaca, New York, called Ithaca College. At the time of her appointment to serve as the new executive director of the Labor-Religion Coalition of New York State in June 2017, the co-chairs of the board of directors acknowledged her work with the coalition and then stated, "Emily has proven herself to be a faithful and brave advocate in the fight to build a more just and equitable world for everyone." I'm very pleased to present to you the Reverend Emily McNeal, Executive Director of the Labor-Religion Coalition of New York State.
Well, thank you so much, Fred, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, you are a hard act to follow, Reverend, so I'll do my best. It is really wonderful to be here with you all today, and I'm very grateful to the Greater Binghamton Labor-Religion Coalition for inviting me and for bringing us all together to have this really important conversation today. So as was mentioned, I just as of recently am the Executive Director of the New York State Labor-Religion Coalition. We are based up in Albany, but work statewide. And our mission is to unite faith, labor, and community in a movement for social, racial, and economic justice in New York State, grounded in our deeply held moral and democratic values. And I believe that we are living through a time when this mission and the work of those of you in this room and of the Labor-Religion Coalition here in Binghamton is just critically important. It always has been, but we're living at a time where it is even more urgent. And so it's really encouraging that we're here today to tackle some of these issues and have this conversation. So as was kind of alluded to, I come to the connection between faith and labor first from the faith side of things. I'm the daughter of a United Methodist minister who served most of his career outside of Rochester. And my faith has always been a very central part of how I understand myself and especially how I understand my vocation in the world. And it was clear to me from a young age, I know it's not clear to all Christians, but it was clear to me that one of the primary, if not the primary teachings of my faith is about justice for the poor and for marginalized and oppressed communities. And so it was my faith that has driven my interest and involvement in social justice work, whether around issues of peace or equal rights or economic justice. And I don't want to spend too much time on my personal biography, but I want to say that my perspective is shaped in part by the time period in which I've grown up. So I was born in 1986, in the heyday of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and really devastating attacks on the labor movement. I was in high school when 9/11 happened, And some of my first activism work was around protesting the Iraq War and the Bush administration. And then when I graduated from college in 2008, we were on the precipice of a financial collapse and the so-called Great Recession, which I would come to understand was the result of rapidly increasing wealth and income inequality that had largely taken place over the course of my life. So with some notable exceptions, I would say that my 31 years on this earth have not been particularly good ones for the cause of justice for the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed. We have been losing a lot of battles over these past few decades. But I also believe, however dire and dangerous the moment we are in is, which it certainly is, I also think we are at a time of great opportunity when the seeds that many of you in this room and others throughout the world have been planting over decades are getting ready to start to come up and bloom. And I think we're catching glimpses of a revival in this really important connection between faith and labor as part of a much larger movement for equality and justice and human rights. So I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about one important example of this, which is the Moral Mondays movement led by Reverend William Barber in North Carolina. How many of you are familiar with Moral Mondays in North Carolina? All right, as I thought, a bunch of you. So just briefly, for those of you who might not be as familiar with it, in 2006, Reverend Barber was elected the president of the NAACP in North Carolina, and along with a number of other leaders, he began to really work on building a stronger coalition of progressive groups that could take action together on issues at the state level. They, over several years of really hard relationship building and organizing work, they built a coalition of, I think now it's over 100 groups that coalesced around a 14-point platform that very intentionally brought together labor rights and civil rights and voting rights and women's rights and environmental justice, opposition to the Iraq War, and united people around this multi-issue perspective. Moral Mondays gained a lot of attention in 2013 when they started doing weekly civil disobedience demonstrations at the state capitol in Raleigh. And over the course of a summer, over 1,000 people were arrested in these demonstrations. But what you may not know is that one of the first victories of this budding coalition was a victory around a union organizing campaign in 2008 at Smithfield Foods, which is a pork processing plant in Tar Heel, North Carolina. And through that campaign, over 5,000 workers joined the UFCW after a very brutal, repressive campaign from the bosses to quash the union effort. This was a third effort at organizing that plant. And listen to what their contract had in 2008 in North Carolina in the South. $15 an hour wage, paid sick leave, vacation, health care, retirement benefits, guaranteed minimum hours, a just cause provision for job security, and improvements in safety at the plant. So there's so much to say about that organizing effort, and I would really recommend the book No Shortcuts by Jane McElvey. She spends a chapter looking at this campaign and why in 2008 it was finally successful. But one of the factors she does identify is the support from community leaders and faith leaders. And not just as outside allies, kind of as faith mobilizing to support the union, but understanding and framing the issue as a community issue. That in some ways, these aren't separate communities. In many ways, they're not. The workers are people of faith. People in the congregations are workers, whether at this particular plant or not. And so this was an issue of justice for the whole community. And not only did the religious leaders help to frame that, but they also took really significant, effective action. They organized pickets and boycotts, in particular, targeting places that sold Smithfield products. And that was a really important point of leverage that helped give the workers power at the negotiating table and helped them be successful. So there's so much more to learn from about this movement and that campaign in particular, but I hope you'll take the opportunity to investigate more about this. But I want to talk just briefly about some things I think we can learn from these examples for our work as faith and labor leaders here in New York State. One is the purpose of our gathering here today, right? Probably to affirm there is this deep connection between the values of the labor movement and the values of our faiths. At its best, the labor movement has not been just about better conditions for its own members, but about a transformed society, about a society that lifts up the rights of the poor and the working class, and a commitment to the dignity of all people. Also, a core value of the union movement is solidarity, this understanding that our faiths are interconnected and that we put the good of the whole in front ahead of our own selfish interests. I think it should be obvious to us the resonance of those values with the values of our faiths, right? And not just Christianity, but the values of all major religions that uphold an absolute commitment to the dignity and value of all human life and of life in general. A commitment that we're compelled to care for our community as a whole, and especially to care for those who are most vulnerable, the poor and the marginalized. So this is really strong common ground that we have to draw from. But I think that both the labor and the faith communities can do a better job of articulating these values in public, and also of making plain to our constituencies how these values are different from the dominant values of our capitalist society. I think that there have been times when both faith communities and labor communities have tried to present ourselves as fitting in to the dominant culture, especially as we've seen ourselves in decline. We've wanted to show how we fit in. But in fact, our role is a prophetic one. It's to uphold values that are actually quite contrary to the dominant values of a capitalist society. And we have to reclaim that role and not be afraid of it. Related to that, I think we have to grapple with the reality of our decline over the last several decades. And that's happening both in organized labor and in many of our faith communities. And because of that reality, it's an opportunity for us to be open to different ways of doing things. The labor movement by itself is not strong enough to win the significant kind of economic and cultural and values changes that we need in our society. And likewise, religious institutions on their own do not have the influence that we once did. But yet we do have extraordinary gifts and strengths born out of decades and centuries and generations of history and experience and wisdom that we must bring to bear in a larger movement for justice and human rights. While our power might be limited on our own, as Reverend Melvin said, when we come together, when we unite faith and labor and community allies and see our members and our constituencies as beyond our own membership roles or beyond the people sitting in our pews, we have the power that we need to take on the structures that are aligned against us. So I want to close by talking specifically about some things that the New York State Labor-Religion Coalition is working on here in New York State to try to explore these kind of relationships. So some of you may have heard that Reverend Barber recently announced he's stepping down from the North Carolina NAACP to join the leadership of a new Poor People's Campaign. This Poor People's Campaign is an effort that a number of grassroots organizations around the country have been working on for a few years to revive the Poor People's Campaign that Dr. Martin Luther King and others led in 1968, and that actually took place shortly after Dr. King was assassinated. Next year is the 50th anniversary of that campaign, and there are plans not only to commemorate this anniversary, but to actually relaunch this campaign. A half century ago, Dr. King declared that the evils of racism and militarism and materialism would have to be tackled together, and that the only way to do so is to unite those most impacted, the poor and working classes across lines of race and geography and identity, in a movement that would demand economic and human rights for all people. This is obviously no easy task. But leaders like Reverend Barber and others in taking on this Poor People's Campaign believe that Dr. King's analysis was right and that it holds true today. And in fact, that the need for this kind of movement that he imagined is even more urgent now. And I really agree with that analysis of where we are. So this summer, Labor-Religion Coalition of New York State and some of our partners have been holding a Truth Commission on Poverty in New York State. And this project is part of a series of hearings that are happening around the country with the National Poor People's Campaign as a very preliminary step in trying to build this unity among movements and people. So far, we've held 2 public hearings in Allegheny County in Western New York. We held one in Schenectady last month, and we're holding a third in September on Long Island. And at these hearings, directly impacted people, advocates, direct service providers, and others have shared stories about dealing with poverty and related injustices in our communities throughout New York State. The goal of sharing these stories is first to remind ourselves collectively of the crisis that we're in and of the cost to our communities and to individuals that it's taking. Second, we want to remind folks who are experiencing poverty or on the brink of poverty that they're not alone and that poverty is not people's faults. It's structural. And third, to remind ourselves of the connections that already exist between the experiences of folks in places as diverse as rural Allegheny County, urban Schenectady, and suburban Long Island. And finally, this project is also about identifying leaders. It's about finding people who are willing to take the very bold and brave step of telling their stories and who are yearning to join with other folks in taking action to build a better society. And so out of this project, we are going to produce a report that will actually be released here in Binghamton, October 17th through 18th, as part of an event with Reverend Barber and leaders of the Poor People's Campaign. And during that time, we'll also be talking about how we can more effectively unite faith and labor and community across the state to take on issues of a state level of importance. And we'll be discussing as well how those of us in New York State can relate to this National Poor People's Campaign, which is really going to kick off next spring. So I am at the end of my time, but I just want to close by saying we are living in dangerous times, and the stakes are very high. I don't have to tell any of you that. But I really do believe that we're also living in a time of great opportunity. And more people are waking up to the injustices of our current political and economic systems. And that, to me, gives me hope. So thank you so much for having me here with you, and I look forward to our conversation.